So hello. So welcome to today's etc. talk. This is actually one that could easily have happened in December. So we try and do one talk a month where we invite a different artist to come and talk to us about the evolution of their practice. And today we have Kofi joining us. This is going to be a real pleasure to be able to talk to him about some of his practice, about the evolution of his work, and about kind of recent and current work that he's developing. These talks are always run in line with our wider program at Draw Brighton. So at Draw Brighton, we run sessions down in Brighton, but we also have an international online program, of which this is a really important part. So although we focus a lot on portrait and life drawing sessions, we just think it's really important to enrich our understanding of our own practices by reflecting on the practice of other artists. And this talk is a really wonderful opportunity to get to know artists you might not have been introduced to before, or for those that do know, particularly that know Kofi's work, it's a great opportunity to get a little bit of an insight into how somebody's work has developed. In this talk, we're going to be going through a series of images, and Kofi's going to be talking on those images as we go. And it's also recorded to be made public after the session, so you will be able to come back to it if you wanted to revisit the talk. And for anyone that misses it, hopefully you're catching up in the recording. So hi to those that are joining us in the recording as well. So Kofi's a UK-based artist who's been involved in the underground black arts movement from the 80s onwards. Some of you might know Kofi from the 2020 Sky Portrait Artist of the Year, although he's been a long time artist and artist educator in the UK. And so I've had the pleasure of meeting Kofi in person a few years ago, I think it was now. And we had a great conversation, of which this feels like it's kind of now picking up again. So I'm just going to give you the option to unmute and just welcome you. Thank you so much for doing this talk for us today.
Thank you very much, Jake. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, people. How is everybody?
Thumbs up coming around.
Good. Nice to see you all. You're taking the time out to come and listen. And I was sharing with Jake that this is kind of my first official um, exposure to sharing my life as an artist to a wider audience. So it's going to be quite an interesting um, journey for me, and I hope it's interesting for you to listen to. So shall we start then, Jake?
Wonderful. I'll just be prompted by you on when you'd like to click through, but I'm really interested with to know what we're starting with here.
Well, I mean, this will not be related to any work that you see after this, but it will give you an insight to where kind of my career started. And I went to art school, and I actually studied graphic design because as a black young boy with West Indian parents, art wasn't really an option. So I went to art school and I studied graphic design, and then actually went into advertising. But truly, at my heart, I was a painter, and I loved drawing. So I graduated back. But in that journey, I first met a man named Roy Alderson, and Roy was a trompe-l'oeil artist, and he was known right from about 30s, and he became quite popular. And he used to work for interior magazines like um, Tatler, and that covered like interior spaces that was more for the middle and high end bourgeoisie market. And as a young black West Indian boy, my first experience as being paid quite well was working with Roy. So I worked under him, and this is an image that's quite famous of his, and I helped to restore this image, and it was in the Interior Design magazine one year, and they used to cover his house because his house was a really interesting house, full of paintings, all the walls, trompe-l'oeil paintings from top to bottom. If you went to the sink, the bathroom, on the ceilings, and I redone some of those work for him in his own home, and I actually then worked outside on other projects, and then began to do that work in people's homes, and then abroad in some cases, etc. So I was doing murals and doing a very tight work, very realistic work.
Hmm.
So if you want to move on. So I was telling you how diverse, you know, my experience as an artist is, because I don't come from a kind of traditional line. So this is a painting I done when I my first visit to Ghana. This was quite a long time ago. It will reveal my age, but what happens is, as a person in the diaspora, what happens is you want to make a journey, you want to understand who you are, and as an artist, for me, most of my life, that discovery came through my art. And so you go back home to the Caribbean where your parents are born, and then you begin to understand the history and the presence of how people arrived on the island. You begin to understand how from those plantations and you trace back your parents. And for me, that took me to back to Ghana. So the first I always wanted to go to Africa. So the first place I ended up was to Africa was Ghana, where I knew most Antiguans were from. And this is of an elder. She's you could say a senior chief. She's kind of like a district chief. So you have to pay your respects to her. You cannot stand over her. You have to be introduced to her. And they asked me to paint this image of an ancestor of her. Um, so I'm sitting in a village in a forest, and they would come with all these paints and blocks, and we would go down, and they got me to go to this little town to pick up these paints, just household paints, just paint brushes, whatever sticks, and that I used those materials to paint this particular picture. And this was her, and you're going to see a picture of her, I think, on the next slide, right, Jake, if you can go to the next slide.
Oh.
So this image is called Mother Elder Woman. And when I came back from Ghana, this was one of I created a collection called Humble. And that collection, at that time, there were no kind of real African centered images in the UK. So, and if you look through books, you would only privilege to them if you went through coffee books, but there were no real artistic African centered images. And the few that you saw were coming from African American artists, and any Caribbean artists were kind of really in really private galleries. There were no, to the general public, or say the Black community, we didn't have access to. So I felt it necessary to reflect and paint what I experienced. And the lady in the middle is the lady that you saw in the photograph previously, and that's her mother. To the right of you, and then to the left, that's her daughter, and that's her daughter's daughter. So it's called Mother Elder Woman, right? And what I'm using there, because I was practicing as a designer in advertising, I used to do the mock-up boards,
Hmm.
but you had access. You can only have access to certain materials. So this is created on a board called the CS10 board. And I know many of you will not be familiar with that. Many of you may do, but it was a board they used for architecture. So you could paint on, you could actually scrape off. So I used to
Hmm.
use it for drawing really fine lines, right? So I used to work on these boards because they kind of gave me the textures that I wanted. So I actually used a blade to scrape off and create the textures and feel and the flow that you see in the work that you see there.
And
Yeah.
the paint, is it oil paint or acrylic paints?
Um, it's actually an ink. The brown's in a brown ink because I would be using brown ink for some like mock-ups. So I use an ink for these, and then I use a, a, a basic watercolor paint. And you could, and to get that kind of resilience, I would just put on two cuts, just straight from the tube, and then
Hmm.
take off with the knives. So instead of drawing, you literally be drawing with a blade. And I'll use about 2 or 3 different blades, standing off blades, to actually then construct a picture. So we should move on to the next image. So that was a series called Humble, this image was the image that kind of encapsulated the idea of the humility. So when I went to Africa, the experience I had, what that men how men conducted themselves. There was a humility because they were carrying babies on their backs, holding hands, and um, no matter how big you are or how older you are, there was a sense of a hierarchy. So everybody seemed to have their place, and they had no problem with their place. If you had to go, everybody had their place in society, in the village, and they seemed to know what theirs was, and that played out. So I wanted to create an image that kind of represented that humility, and this is an image that I worked on, and you can see there what that process of working on CS10 board. I really like that. So I used that process for quite a long time in my career. I was experimenting with other things, but I had access to this material. And let me say that CS10 board was very expensive at that time. You really cherished it. Right? It used to cost me an arm and a leg. But when you got the material, so you couldn't mess up when you had a board. You had to make sure that whatever you worked in had to work. But my career as an artist, working in advertising, I um, left at the advertising business and I set up a business of my own with a partner of mine that I went to art school with. And because we're kind of diverse in our interest in creativity, we done many things. We done installations, we done murals in shops, we done things to do ceiling work, we done prints, and we would do graphics on the side. So it's a kind of multidisciplinary business where we just done things that we were really interested in, and those who took the risk to employ us, we would then make work alongside that. That was our own personal work. Yeah. So I was always painting and creating alongside my mainstream job, which was being commissioned by maybe doing graphic design work and doing some murals on floors in shops, etc. So we can move on. And that kind of this mural is when I kind of came back into the mainstream, as I worked predominantly within the Black community, and many of the work that we created at that period, say the 80s and coming into the 90s, it wasn't really seen by the wider community. And we started off work in our houses. So we used to have open studios. They were kind of the very first Black open studios, meaning that there weren't galleries, there weren't really art shops that would take them, and there weren't any Black shops that would take them. So we used to do open studios in our house. And that experience working with Roy, I was always doing murals.
Mhm.
And this was I would say my second mural, maybe my third mural coming back into the mainstream. And this was commissioned by a charity called Hospital Rooms. And this is done down in Springfield Hospital. And it's quite a large mural, and it spans across three wall spaces. And it was quite a privilege to do it because my mum worked at this hospital as a supported nurse, and then I was asked to come back and create a mural in this space, and they didn't know that at all. But so that was quite a privilege. If we go into the next,
Did your mum know about that as well?
she did. Fortunately, she did, and she saw it before she passed. She passed it a couple of years ago, and it was just nice to sit with her because I used to take her to go and see her at lunch, and I would sit with her and wait for her. So I was in that old hospital, but that mural that you saw was in the new hospital. And working with Roy, I learnt to scale up work by hand. You draw up work by hand, and you always so you learn to kind of not just grid up, but hand draw and drawing things to scale, working on scaffoldings. You didn't have projectors and things like that. So you kind of developed a skill that maybe some artists nowadays don't necessarily have because you don't get an opportunity to, because you've got technology to assist us. So much of the work that I've done with in the early days in murals in people's house, and then commissioned with larger murals, outside murals, literally on a ladders, scaling up things by eye.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
and
just
this,
having to get back, get some distance from it, see the hole,
yeah,
and then dive back in.
yeah. And now it's kind of really seems bonkers that you could do it that way. And I probably lost a lot of that skill, because nowadays you have projectors, and you can scale up things really quickly because you're always pushed for time. But you was able to do those things quite quickly, even though you was always pushed for time because it was a commercial job. But you just had that skill to be able to do that. And this is a mural in a Soho house, which is a private members club, and they gave me an open brief to present what I wanted in this space, and it was really done in bricks and to represent the kind of migration patterns of Caribbean people coming over here first, right? So what you see is that kind of migration of how Caribbean, that experience of landing here, and also the background of the narrative that underlies that, which is that kind of African experience. So with Caribbean people, they always dress up. So you had to dress up in suits and ties. If you went back to the Caribbean, everybody dressed up. And when they came over, everybody dressed up. And there was no such thing as being casual. You know, everybody was always dressed up as if they're going to a ball or a party the next day. And in gloves, hats, all the nines. And that was a mural I'd done, and again, quite quickly. And it was a joy to just um, produce that and being asked to do that. So my work flips between installation, murals, portraiture. I'm kind of really interested in landscapes at the moment too. So that will probably be the next adventure. If we could move on. And drawing has always been kind of intricate to my practice. But I come from quite, I could say, conservative, but not so. So in my graphic design course, I would spend half of it in the fine art rooms, which you weren't really allowed because I was actually studying graphics. And I used to
Mm.
just draw. I used to go down there, and because the art teacher knew I had such a love of drawing, he would just allow me in. So I actually spent my um, design course, actually half of it doing fine art, and just as a parallel. And I would say probably produced more fine art work than I did doing graphics there. And I just love um, the act of drawing, kind of expression of line. And here, as a black artist in in a diaspora, that influence of kind of European art and black art movements, they kind of become merged in how the work is influenced. And when you're looking at, by being in a place, you can't help but be impressed upon art that is good. So when you're looking at European art, you're just enthralled with it in the same way as you're interested in your own work and your own culture. So when I went to Italy, um, some of the things I used to paint in people's houses, of church frontages and different cities in Italy, I was painting those in people's houses as trompe-l'oeil work, and then I was able to go to Italy and walk around these places that I had been painting for quite a long time. So that was always a beautiful experience. And some of my most favorite artists from, say, the Renaissance period in Italy was Tiepolo, and he was always a kind of artist that I leaned to. And Spencer, as an artist in the UK, who was a great muralist too. So you can't help but be influenced by those artists. If you could move on. I was always interested in the representation of people and portraits. And it's a sideline, but not a sideline. It means, I think, as a black artist, you feel responsible to paint people that mainstream would not really be acknowledged or interested, or people that have contributed to spaces that are kind of just within an awareness of a people that that you can appreciate and know they have contributed to your life. And this is a young architect who is who was a friend of my son's, and he's still an architect and quite a progressive architect. And the image is called Black Star. Of course, there's not many black architects at that time. This was must have been about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And what you see is in the text is actually documenting different artists over different periods of the art and the art development around the world. If we move on to the next image, and this is another image of his. Much of our journey, like any other culture, is to kind of understand who we are. And for each of us in the diaspora, that takes place in two ways. One, it takes place as a creative, being in a European environment and being influenced by the creativity from that European narrative. And then it also takes place in a parallel with kind of your search for your own African or centered, origins. And when you create work, that relationship between what you create and how you create is always there. And
Did you get a coffee?
No, I actually came with one, so I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if you've been downstairs already, but did Brad mention not to worry about doing much down?
Someone accidentally unmuted there. Sorry. Carry on, Kofi.
So if you go into our next image.
Thanks so much.
And I'm like any other artist. I would, from time to time, I would do a self-portrait, right? And I'm just like everybody else who's influenced by white artists, and you probably know this artist, that it was kind of in honor of an artist. I'm sure you guys can guess. This is basically it's called portrait of a self-portrait of a black artist. I have a hat like Vincent, a beard like Vincent. Yeah. And it's again, whether scrolled onto it are personal artist friends that I knew. A couple of them are not around anymore, but they're kind of in honor of them too. So it's portrait. The title of the piece is called Self-Portrait, Portrait of a Black Artist. Yeah. And shall we move on to the next image? Now, this was the portrait that I submitted for Portrait Artist of the Year. And I done about three portraits. And the first two dismally didn't work out very well. And I then just decided to paint just exactly what I want, because you're always trying to paint for someone else. And those kinds of submissions, they kind of, there's a little pressure there. But ultimately, the only way to go is to paint something that you really enjoy and that is really about you. So the two images in the background are, they relate to two sculptures that represent an ancestors and the origins of humans, which is the beginning of man, which is the kind of feminine aspect, which is on the left-hand side, and that the other side is an ancestral march, and it's called contemplation. And that's something I'm always in the process of contemplating, the notions of African art, where it comes from, why it was created in a certain way. And that's kind of, in a way, been my own personal investigation that I continue to have. So, but this was a submission for Portrait Artist of the Year that allowed me to get onto the series.
How was that experience for you as well, being on the Portrait Artist of the Year?
Intensely pleasant. And why I say that, because as a say a slightly older artist, I don't get ruffled so much. So I was there for me, I went there and I kind of just enjoyed the process. But looking at some of the younger artists, it is quite an intense process. Yeah. So you just have to really paint for yourself when you're in such a space. And if you kind of get into your own zone, you're interfered with a lot. But if you kind of get into your own zone and you truly really just paint for yourself, then that's the way I process that. Yeah. So I wasn't really trying to paint for anybody in particular. I just painted for myself, got into my zone, and was just trying to represent the person in front of me in the best way I knew how. But I could see the pressure on the younger artists around me. So that wasn't, that's the pressure I saw. For me, it was pleasant, but for many artists, it's quite a um, stressful process.
Yeah.
So can we move on? So during that, you had to produce, I got to the finals, and you have to, each artist has to go away and produce a portrait of a person that's close to them or of their choosing. So this was the portrait I done of my son, and well, that was presented in the finals. And again, you only have a real short space of time to do a full scale portrait. And on reflection, I maybe should have done something a little bit smaller. As being ambitious, it's quite a large piece. It's about about 4 by 4, and but it was really a joy to do, because I never really I'd drawn my son on numerous occasions, but I've never done a really full scale painting of him. So it allowed me to do that and then present someone that I kind of really cared about. And he has Chinese heritage, because his mum's Chinese Caribbean, and allowed me to kind of represent that in the portrait. So you've got Jamaican, Antiguan, and then you've got Chinese there. So those fruits kind of represent those different aspects of the culture. You know? And he's a mixologist. Yeah.
Have you always included text in your work? Has that been a big thing, kind of going back through your practice?
Yeah, I think that's coming from the design world. Text has always been kind of intricate to trying to express a narrative, and sometimes you always feel that the words need to be said in some way. And I know that's influence from being a designer and doing graphics, but I always feel like when you're writing something, overlaying something, it kind of gives you layers to how someone can read the image.
Mhm.
And so what you have is the names of fruit. I can't quite remember them. You have the names of the fruit in the background. You have all the places across his shoulders that where his family are from, and that kind of notion of not being really clear, because he's on his own journey. So he's been back to the Caribbean, he's been to Jamaica, and now he's got to go to China for his own journey to kind of build that notion of his own identity as a person. So it's kind of unfinished. So I kind of wanted to reflect that in the work. So can we move on? So whenever you are in the early periods of my career, you never really had access to kind of books. And then when I went to art history classes, of course, there was no kind of evidence of Black people who really created work. And when you looked at the narrative of art history, there were no Black artists in that narrative and in that timeline. They really weren't acknowledged at that time. So you had to go back and do that for yourself. And part of it is it's an initiation process for, if there's not a presence of you, you have to kind of make your own journey. And there was nobody there to kind of teach me about art history. So I took it upon myself to kind of really begin to just get immersed in African art and begin to understand it. And you can only understand it if you you can't do it from an outsider. So I was going to initiate you into an African tradition, and allows you to understand the ritual processes of how and why the work is produced. So much of African art is ritual based. And then what you have is continuity and relationships between the figures that kind of give you a hierarchy and the importance of figures. Larger figures are, the importance of larger figures are large, smaller figures are smaller, but it gives you, when you see how a piece is structured, it will give you the structure of the society, the importance, say, in terms of often when the head is larger, it tells you the importance of the intelligence of the individual or where the intelligence lies and what lies upon that head. And say in terms of it may be an animalistic image, it tells you the notion of that intelligence that it sits on the head. So the head is intelligence in the brain, the thought comes from the top. So it allows you to understand where that person or that notion of intelligence sits. And then you also see also that upright images throughout African art, and that idea that it's always abstracted. So abstraction, say from say European terms, is pulling around the idea of form and this perspective to how people see the world. Then from an African viewpoint, it's because Africans understand that the world lives on multi levels. And in order to express that in art, you have to immediately move to an abstract form. Because to express that reality, it's a multiplicity of realities that exist within the one. And you can't necessarily do that through a realistic form. You have to abstract the form. So then you'll find the underpinning of African art becomes abstracted, because underlying that is because they understand that the world exists on the multiplicities of existence, meaning the spirit world, the animated world, the physical world, etc. And then those play a part into how you construct your figure. Just shall we move on? And there are many great artists like prehistory, but in African art they never ever really sign their work. Fortunately for us, this particular artist his name is Olawale of Ise, and he comes from a place of called Ise in Nigeria, which is a village. But he was a very famous carver, and he carved work. He worked up into the 1930s, but he was really commissioned by a lot of the chiefs in the Ifa tradition, and he's really famous because he was responsible for the pillars that were found in the Benin palaces when that was raided. And when you sit and see this work for years in books, and I kind of researched it, and then you're able to go and see it in real life, that's a real marvelous, magical experience when you can actually see the real things. So all his work are in museums now, and very rare you've got to dig deep. I went to Barcelona to have a look at some of his work, or they're in private hands. So it's very difficult to go and see original pieces. And his work is really indicative to how it explains the structure and organization of society. And you'll see that at the base of the chair, that women are the ones that hold up the king, and they are the pillars of society. And without them, you can't do anything. The other thing in terms of, and the seat is where the king sits, but who controls the seat are the women, meaning the matriarchal element of society. And they are responsible in the background for actually carrying out all things in societies. So you see in African society, the matriarchal system always comes first, and you can see it embedded in the structure from which the sculptures are made. And on the left-hand side, you'll see this is an offering vase, and that's normally presented to the king, and that top comes off. So they would put either herbs and different things in that for the offering. And it may be to the king, but also to a particular deity. And again, you'll see that relationship, the people who are offering that. And what you have is the procession on the top of the king, and behind, sitting with the king, behind the king, you will always have a woman, or beside the male figure, the figure will be sitting, the female figure will be sitting beside. If we go back a few, if you go back, so what you see, no, next one down, yeah, okay. So what you see here, there is an equality to when you see in African art, male and female figures are often in conjunction equal. And you'll see that the female figure often is supporting the male figure, because the male figure cannot exist without the female principle. And there's an equality to that. But in a sense, when you see in Olowavise's work, often you see in his sculptures that the female figure is much larger than the male figure, because she sits behind but dominates the king that the sculpture's around, and it's telling you the importance of her presence. And without her, he cannot exist, he cannot rule, and all what he understands come through that principle of the femininity. And that's, that's normally presented as through a kind of trance process. And so you see that that's often expressed through the eyes in the figure. Sometimes if it's ritual and if representing trance, you'll see that the eyes are always wide, or the eyes are whited out, because that's what happens when you go into trance states. If we move on a couple then, Jake. Feel free to interject, Jake, if I'm going too fast.
Oh no, I'm just really enjoying listening, to be honest. This is so informative. It's wonderful to kind of have your perspective. So yeah, I'm really happy going through. I am interested to know actually about whether you've experimented with sculpture yourself and how that might come into practice, but we can talk about that later.
Yes. So this is another one of Olowavise's pieces, and it's called Offering Bowl. And when you go to Africa, you will always see these birds, that are running around the village. And when you in the mornings, you'll hear that cock-a-doodle-doo in the mornings, right? Every morning you'll hear a rooster that wakes you up. And so each morning, if you live in a space like that, they actually mark the beginning of the next day. Then other sounds of animals, they mark the end of the day. So what you'll see in African tradition, they pull from those surroundings, which then present symbolically this notion of time, of space, of movement, and cycles. And then you'll see integrated into all these animals, when they represent certain principles about life. And you begin to now document and understand the world around you. So all animals are responsible for allowing you to understand place in time. So migrational animals that move and reappear every time in a certain place, you'll see that means 1,000 miles away, or where they're migrating from, that everything's well. If they don't turn up, something's wrong, right? And what you mean, you see the roost, this particular bird, the sacrifices are made. So what you'll see is that lid is open, and then what is put in there is offered to the chief or the king. Yeah, and you'll see the woman who will do that. That's the offering that she's making. It will dependent on what's in that. When you take off the lid, what's in that when he opens it, and it will be particular things that will give us certain elements of energies, plants, oils, etc. That will give off a certain element of an energy. So we move on. Where are we now? So there are no portraits of Olowavize, so I felt that it's important that I should do a portrait of him.
Mm-hmm.
And this portrait is called Olowavize, We Await Their Return. And then what you'll see in his work, as I said before, is that kind of acknowledgement of the feminine principle in society, the matriarchal systems that actually run our societies. So it's not the other way around. Patriarchal system actually it's a kind of a bit of a fallacy that that's the dominant place. The reality of the world is actually matriarchal, and that's how Africans see the world. So it's kind of celebrated in the kind of sculptures and their structures, and you'll see it right through his work. So I created this piece really in honor of him, and he's known as one of the first he's known in the European tradition as a master artist, and he's one of the first that was kind of presented as a master, a grand master of his style and his art. And you can research him, you can go in, you'll find images of him. But when you go back to Nigeria, they do honor him, but there's very few really great books around. And there is a book that was written by a European art historian that's quite good. But to get hold of that book, I'm still trying to do that. So this is all the way of his saying, we wait their return.
Do you think there'll be much opportunity for his work to be recognized, and for some of those those elements of scholarship to kind of come out in future around his work, or are too many of the resources lost, do you think?
I think there, but I think it's incumbent that, say as a black artist, we in some way we should take on that responsibility, and not just to document him and present him, honor him, but also kind of present that to the wider world in terms of we acknowledge him as part of the art history narrative, up with Picasso's and Rembrandt's of the world. So I see him like that, but that you will never see him on that level. I'd be acknowledged. So I think it's incumbent that I do it for myself and acknowledge it to the world and to people. Shall we move on? So this is a painting called Carib Boy, meaning Caribbean boy, right? And in my heart, I'm a Caribbean, Antiguan boy, who has always been interested in, and what you see is a kind of narrative and nostalgia about that relationship with my parents. So when we used to go home to Antigua, even though you lived in Europe, you still had to go and move the cows out, take the cows out in the morning before you went to school. And I used to go with a friend of mine named Robin, and we would take the cows out. So you get up at 5 o'clock, you take the cows out to pasture, and you come back. And it'll be kind of as the sun rises, right? And what I loved about the Caribbean and going to Africa, you don't have to worry about clothes too much. You don't have to wear layers. You put on something, and you get a bit lazy. You just put on either your swimming trunks, you put on the top, or maybe not, and you just go out and you wander around until whatever time, and you come back. Right? So that kind of freedom. But in the background of this image is the Victoria and Albert Museum. And when I was young, you didn't know that you could go to life drawing classes, etc. My parents didn't know those things. So I used to go off on Saturday mornings and go to the Victoria and Albert and just sit and draw those stuffed animals, right? And that was a kind of my first introduction to kind of art history, because it wasn't taught in schools. So that's where my focus, and that went on for years. And because you was part of, even within your own, it was quite a strange thing to do as a young Caribbean boy. But so I would take a little packed lunch and I'd go there and I'd spend the whole day, and then I have to ring the bell, wait for the bell, and I realize they're closing. I need to get out of it before they switch off the lights, right? Yeah. So I would work in that space all day. Time would just go by. And but I actually learned and understood. It provoked me to kind of look into my history by drawing and looking at those things, animals from in the environments and countries that would, that I'd never had an experience of. And what you see on the right hand side are my parents, and they was open-minded enough to support this a child that they knew could only go through the art route, but they had no idea what that would be or what that looked like. So I needed to kind of pay my respect to them, and that's why they're in this. That's why they're in this image. So if you move on to the next image, this image is again kind of in the same style, and I was explaining to a couple of artists in Kenya, in a trip I've just gone to, that when you're in a diaspora, you have to recreate this notion of Africa. It's kind of a construct, right? Because, and they asked me, well, why do you do that? And I say this: it's a way you survive. It's a way you allow, because there's always a feeling of another place within you. You want to. I think there's not just for Black people, but there's this feeling of migrating back to your origins, and I think it's for all races, but in particular, Black people, where their bodies sit in an environment that is more conducive to their kind of DNA. And this image is called "Why Can't I See the Stars?" Right? It's asked by the young boy, and before I maybe at a stage in people's lives when they ask their mother and father about their reality around them, the nature around their and the cultures that they were embedded in, they kind of knew the answers, and now we kind of don't know the answers. So this young boy's asked the question, "Why can't I see the stars?" And the father has to go to a book, and that's crazy. You have to go to the book to explain to the child what's around him, what the plants are, etc. And so his wife looks at him and says, "Why are you going to the book? What what's wrong with you?" And in many African cultures, the monkey is plays a particular role to an aspect of a man's thinking. And there's his name is Elegba or Anansi or Sebek. There's different names from African cultures, but it actually represents the intellect of man. And then what you see is the monkeys looking at him saying, why are you going to the book?" Yeah. The baboon is most sophisticated in terms of structure, society, and the intellect that lays within the baboon. And the other monkey species are lower intellect. So you also often see that the baboon is really thoughtful, even in his gestures. He'll sit thoughtfully, like he's thinking about things, considering what he's going to do. And so monkeys that sit for a long time, there's a notion that they're really thoughtful and reflective in terms of how they think about the world and how they consider the structure of their society. And so you see the animals immersed in that, and also questioning the man why he has to go to the book. So there's a kind of separation that takes place between the mother, the father, who's now kind of lost that kind of notion and understanding, intuitive nature of his surroundings, and then the son who's trying to understand why you can't see the stars. So if we move on to the next images. Okay. So from that kind of upright gesture, it plays a lot sometimes when I look at my figurative work. And what you see, I mean, it is quite once you get into understanding African art in a certain way and the reasons why it was structured in a certain way, it naturally influences how you kind of represent that in terms of representational side of the figure. And here, these works are actually taken from a Maasai dancer, contemporary Maasai dancer. He's called Fernando. and he's a contemporary expressionist, and at the root of his practice is the Maasai notion of movement. So it's a very upright notion of how you move. And then you'll see that kind of rigidity in a lot of African art. And it's often to do with that notion of the spine being upright and when the body's strong. So you'll see if you sit in a village, you'll see people really up into the origin, the spine is really straight. You'll see women carrying loads on their head, and they have to be very upright. But it also represents the notion of once that deterioration starts, of the spine starts to take place, it means that old age is encroaching and the intelligence is interfered with. So you'll see that the upright notion is really important. That's represented in Africana, and it's a continuity across many African traditions. So you'll never see a king slouching in traditional art. He doesn't slouch. He's not sitting on the chair with his arms up and picking his, or doing anything with his ear. He's always in an upright, and he has to sit up, and he'll sit up like you kind of see the Queen. They'll sit up through 5-6 hours, ceremony, and you'll just see him just sitting in a certain way. So I was kind of exploring that notion of the spine and that upright principle, and you'll really see it strongly in Maasai dancing. And they, in figurative art, they just look really stunning. And all Maasai have this kind of really upright, proud posture. So if you go to our next image. And here is another image. And these are works I tend to work on wood panels because it gives you a certain texture and kind of that influence of African art working on wood. So I've always used wood as an option because it helps me to kind of connect and pull from working with an organic material. And even so, you are maybe getting it from B&Q. The textures or allowing the wood to kind of play a part of the narrative in terms of this kind of the textures that come through the wood, and using those textures to kind of express, play a part in the representation of the figure. And in the work you saw previously, I often tend to leave the surfaces of the wood to play its own role in how the narrative is presented.
So we've got lovely sort of stained grain coming through, and then those very clear, more opaque blocks of green and white on here. I mean, it's lovely to be able to see the process in the painting.
Yeah, I mean, I've often worked with dyes, and dyeing is really, you'll see it in a lot of African batik dyeing, but really strong colors. So I'm kind of leaning back to that now to work with dyes more onto the wood, and the way they sink into the surface or play a role on the surface, and they will take to the surface in different ways, and obviously according to the surface of the wood, it will play a part into how it's absorbed or not absorbed. So I do like working with dyes. I intend to kind of work with the dyes a little bit more. And I've just been doing a little research, and I started to use kind of ink dye inks in the very early work, and then I started to use more textile dyes that they use for clothing onto the wood panels, and that's still something I'm investigating.
So you'll dye the wood, let that dry, and then or kind of set in, and then work over the top in opaque paint.
Yeah, I mean, there is when you do batik, it's kind of do the wax. You put on wax as you draw out you put wax onto the material, then you put it into a bucket and you color the material. And then where it's waxed, obviously the dye doesn't take. But Africans are really sophisticated, so that also can work on hard surfaces like that. But it depends on the fluidity of the wax. Yeah. So it's got to be really not too hot, but fluid. If it's dries quite quickly, but there's an element and texture that when you put it onto the wood, then you place paints, pigments onto that, or dyes onto that. It gives you a really interesting texture or integration to how those two materials work together. Right. So that's something I'm working on, and there's a little playing within these three figures that I was experimenting with. So shall we move on to the next? So as a person who's in diaspora, you always, you naturally look at religion and the notion of the origins of religion. And this image is called, it's done for a series called The Rescue of the Madonna. And when you go to Africa, you see really strong swimmers. So there is a notion that black people don't swim really well. They're not really strong swimmers, but that's actually not true. When you go to the villages on the coast, they're very strong swimmers, and they go out and they swim and they're on boats, and it's just a natural environment to them. And they, in the 18th century and 16th century, they actually used to use African swimmers as deep sea divers to kind of pull out treasures. And I was doing a little bit of research around that, what you discover underneath the sea is everything. Civilizations were covered up, periods of time, and if you go down there deep enough, you'll discover all kinds of things. The rescue of the Madonna in theology actually goes back to a principle or principles in African cultures, which becomes a deity that is represented by the sea. So you have to go to the sea to celebrate. And in different periods of African history, there are different ways that principle was represented right across from ancient cultures to present day cultures, traditional cultures. And to rediscover them, there are probably many sculptures still embedded in the sea that go back to ancient times that are still there to be discovered. And the notion of the rescue of the Madonna is about the rescue or the re-establishment of the matriarchal system back into the world. And I think that's really greatly misunderstood. And there's a backlash in Western cultures. Western women are not having it anymore. And I think that's the backlash that's happening. They've had enough. So I feel that that's important, but that notion needs to be rescued. That notion reinstituted back into our societies. We stop putting up with this patriarchal nonsense that's going on. If we move on again. And within my work, I like to create stories. So this is a mother and children playing. They're swimming at the beach, and the child, her daughter, dives down, and she discovers this Madonna that's been buried there. She tells her friends, and all her friends dive. The boys, they dive in to go and see if it's true. And then there's a story that begins, the rediscovery of this notion of the Madonna. And what you'll see is the mudfish there, which is a symbolic principle of a fish that lives between land and the sea. And you'll see sometimes in around different parts of the world the mudfish, which actually lives in mud, and he literally lives on the land and half his life in the sea. Yeah. But it's that principle of the inner world and outer world, the spiritual world, and then the actual world. That symbol of the mudfish became representative of the reality of those two worlds existing alongside each other. So whenever the king wore it, would represent the king's ability to exist within those two realms. So if you go to the next image. Let me kind of wind up here. Yeah, and this still plays on Um, this is called the mudfish prophecy. You know, so at the end of the day, most in most African traditions, so then somebody goes into trance and pulls down on notions and counsels the, the community, and it's done in a very theatrical way. It's like if you go to a ceremony, it's like going to a theatre production, and you'll see it online now in the villages where there are literally, it looks like grand theatre productions of people dressed up in costumes. At the base of it is their understanding of the reality of existence, of consciousness, and they exist. They're fluctuating in between these realities, right? And this, the mudfish prophecy, you see the turtle, and in many cultures, the turtle comes to represent very auspicious things around the cycle of life, because they kind of exist between all these cycles. They come back around again. And you're also these three boys were diving, and they find him. And what you see here, they're just contemplating how they're going to pull this statue up. And what you're seeing all the Madonnas is actually European construct of this notion of the Madonna and matriarchal system, and that's really, it's almost like you've gone full circle, and you're now the collapse of those constructs are now being found again and then pulled out. So this is called the mudfish prophecy. Yeah, and should we go to our last image? I'm sure, I hope we're doing okay for time.
Oh yeah, we just ticked over into to the end of the time. But if you're okay for time, that's the important thing.
Yeah, I'm good. This is the next image. If we go to the next image.
I've possibly not actually got our final image up.
Oh,
Sorry, let me just see if I can, excuse me for a second. I'll just take us off of the share there, and I'll just work out why I'm missing it there. Could I ask you what the last one is?
Rudolph Walker. It's a portrait. He's in yellow.
I am missing it, and I'm just going to see if I can find it. And in that moment, actually, Kofi, could I be cheeky and ask you a question?
Yes, please.
So I was just wondering, because you're very kindly going to be coming down and teaching a course for us in Brighton, and I wondered if you might tell me a little bit more about, for some of the people coming here tonight, I know they're thinking of coming on the course, and I wondered if you'd be able to tell us a tiny bit about what they might expect if they were coming along.
Okay, so if you go to we've always looked at the human figure, say, mostly through European eyes, our notion of human existence, the figure, how it evolved, etc. And what I want to share in the course is kind of delved into those another kind of conceptual constructs of how we can view the figure, and then pull that into the work, into the expression. And what I've done, behind the scenes is, often allowed an African sculpture to just sit with it and then seeing what I'm producing from that sculpture, because you'll find that what sits in front of you, you're trying to get into the mind of the artist that created that piece, and that's a kind of mind-boggling thing to do. If you just draw the human form from its own perspective, if you look at an abstract piece of African art, you're trying to understand why he created this work, and maybe exaggerated the eyes, the hands, etc. But it allows you to question form and the notion of realism and abstraction, how they can sit together. And I want to see what people will create from that process of examination. And that will be probably one of the first day, and seeing what comes out of that conversation, not just visually, but also through our again re-looking at the notion of the figure and how that sits and our approach and our understanding of the figure. So it's going to be a intellectual bit interesting. I mean, I'll probably be fascinated by how people respond and what people say, and it'll probably help me to understand things more. But I'm going to bring my that understanding and research, what I have it into that space and share with people so we can discuss and draw and create. You know,
Fantastic.
that's what I plan on doing. I hope it isn't too cold in Brighton.
Oh, nice. Well, we've got heaters. It's all good.
Right, okay, good.
um, I'm having trouble finding our final image. I'm so sorry.
That's
Would
okay.
would I be able to source it somewhere else very quickly?
No, because I was going to give the people a privilege because it's not out in the public as yet. So I'm
Oh
going to
my
give.
gosh.
But I can. What I will do is I will share when I come down. I will share um, images that I am working on. Uh,
Thank you.
People can kind of see some of the other things I'm working on and help them to provoke um, their own kind of research visually to how they express the human form.
And I mean, so although we can't see an image, could you tell us a little bit about what you are working on at the moment? What your future work is going to look like?
Well, I've when you saw Holloway Visse, we wait for their return.
Mm.
I've always been playing around this kind of interaction between realism and abstraction, but telling stories and narrative, but kind of provoked by African forms. You know, because whenever you look at, normally I say when you see a traditional African form, it will produce for a ceremony or ritual, and that person would be sitting in a space for quite a while. And sometimes the general public you couldn't touch the person, you couldn't be talking to them. They would just sit in this space and they would create this piece. And then nobody would see it until the ceremony. It would come out and they would unveil it, and everybody would. So it was always kind of produced for a particular time, and then sometimes discarded or put back into a real, secret space, and then it wouldn't come out until the following year. Yeah. So it's kind of having that notion to how going into that space and producing work. We do it all the time as creatives, but then looking at it from a different process. And some of the work I want to create, particularly around the figure, is looking at that way, sitting and kind of questioning and using materials that you're maybe sometimes unfamiliar with or familiar to really express what you're doing in that space. And people have talked about it. I've heard people, artists talk about it. They go into a kind of semi-trance state and they're just wondering. But that isn't. It's the way that, as I understand, human beings, Africans, have always understand that trance state. So we naturally are moving into it all the time. And as creatives, you have a greater propensity to just drift in and out. They call you daydreamers, where that's our space. We're always in that. You're always kind of fluctuating between these inner and outer worlds. And it's to kind of sit in that world and um, really immerse yourself and create. Which we do. Many of you probably do it naturally, but to kind of maybe get a little bit more insight about it. It is a question that often rises its head.
Thank you. This has just been such a wonderful opportunity to take a journey through your career as well as to actually get an insight into your work. So thank you so much for making the time for us.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. As I said before, this is actually my first time sharing my journey. And for the people coming down to the masterclass, I've actually just got back from Kenya a couple of days ago. So my head is full. But I was sharing with Jake earlier, and I'm just like, what the heck is going on? But I'm going to bring that energy down and share with you guys. And, let's do some work down there.
It is going to be super exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you for coming down when you come down, and thank you so much for tonight and for this tour through your practice, Kofi. Is
Yeah. So I just thank everybody for taking the time out to come and listen. It's quite a nice thing to do, which you share with other artists what you do. because we often live in a strange world where people don't really understand us. I've always had that experience, and it's nice to share and then have people that really kind of get how you think. I don't think you're too out there. Yeah.
It's really important for us to be sharing together as artists as well, isn't it? I'm going to give everyone the option actually just to unmute if anyone wanted to say goodbye, say thank you. Thank you all of you for coming, and thank you so much, Kofi, for the talk. But everybody, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful. Fabulous talk. It was great.
Good.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Good.
Thanks, Tom.
Take care, people. Take everyone.